Hello and welcome. In this video I will show you how to add a carousel slider, a dots indicator, and a favorite button. First, to use carousel slider and dots indicator in Flutter, we need to add these packages to our pubspec.yaml file, like this. Next, inside the background of flexible spacebar, we use a stack widget. The children of the stack are a list of widgets. The first child of the stack is a carousel slider widget, which displays a series of images that can be swiped horizontally. We use the carousel controller property to assign a controller that allows us to control the carousel programmatically. We use the item count property to specify the number of images to display in the carousel. We use the length of the product's img list, which is passed as an argument to this page and contains the image paths. We use the item builder property to define a function that returns a widget for each item in the carousel. The function takes three arguments: the build context, the item index, and the page view index. The function returns an image widget that displays the image from the products.img list at the given index. The image is fitted to cover the available space. We use the options property to set a class that contains various options for customizing the carousel. We use the height property to set the height of the carousel. We use the height of the screen divided by 2, which is obtained from a variable called heightScreen. We use the autoplay interval property to set the duration between each autoplay transition. We set it to 6 seconds. We use the autoplay animation duration property to set the duration of the animation for each autoplay transition. We set it to 4 seconds. We use the viewport fraction property to set the fraction of the viewport that each image occupies. We set it to 1, which means each image fills the whole viewport. We use the scroll direction property to set the axis along which the carousel can be scrolled. We set it to horizontal, which means the images can be swiped left or right. We use the autoplay property to set a Boolean value that indicates whether the carousel should play automatically or not. We set it to true, which means the carousel will play automatically. We use the onPageChange property to define a function that is called when the current page changes. The function takes two arguments: the index of the new page and the reason for the change. The function sets the state of the widget and assigns the index to a variable called _current, which is used to indicate the current page in the dots indicator. The second child of the stack is a positioned widget, which allows us to position its child relative to the edges of the stack. We use the top property to set the distance from the top edge of the stack to the top edge of the child. We set it to the height of the screen divided by 2.3, which means the child will be slightly below the center of the screen. We use the left and right properties and give them a value of 0, which means the child will be aligned with the center of the stack. We use the child property to set the widget to position. We use a dots indicator widget, which displays a series of dots that indicate the current page of the carousel. We use the dots count property to set the number of dots to display. We use the length of the products.mg list, which is the same as the number of images in the carousel. We use the position property to set the index of the current page. We use the _current variable, which is updated by the onPageChange function of the carousel. We use the decorator property to set a class that contains various options for customizing the dots. We use the size property to set the size of each dot. We set it to 10 by 10 pixels. We use the active size property to set the size of the active dot, which is the dot that corresponds to the current page. We set it to 10 by 10 pixels, which is the same as the size of the other dots. We use the active color property to set the color of the active dot. We set it to white. We use the color property to set the color of the other dots. We set it to black. The third child of the stack is another positioned widget. We use the top property to set the distance from the top edge of the stack to the top edge of the child. We set it to the height of the screen divided by 2.6, which means the child will be slightly above the center of the screen. We use the right property to set the distance from the right edge of the stack to the right edge of the child. We set it to a variable called dfull padding. In child, we use a size box widget, which creates a box with a fixed size. We use the width property to set the width of the box. We set it to 60 pixels. In child, we use an icon button widget, which displays an icon that can be pressed. We use the onPressed property to define a function that is called when the button is pressed. We use an empty function that does nothing. We use the icon property to set the widget to display as the icon. We use a container widget, which can have a decoration, a child, and some padding. We use the padding property to set the amount of space to surround the child with. We set it to 12 pixels on all sides. We use the decoration property to set a class that contains various options for painting the container. We use the color property to set the background color of the container. We set it to white. We use the shape property to set the shape of the container. We set it to circle, which means the container will have a circular border. We use the box shadow property to set a list of box shadows that cast behind the container. We use a single box shadow. We use the blur radius property to set the amount of blur applied to the shadow. We set it to 9 pixels. We use the offset property to set the displacement of the shadow from the container. We set it to 0, which means the shadow will be centered on the container. We use the color property to set the color of the shadow. We set it to gray. In child, we use a SVG picture widget which displays a vector image from an asset file. We use a file located in the assets icons folder and has the name favorite SVG, which is an image of a heart. We use the height property to set the height of the image. We set it to 30 pixels. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and learned something new. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching and see you next time.